Welcome to 2020. Welcome to Point of View, your favorite current affairs show. Welcome to a new decade. Hopefully a decade that will see great strides, not just for us here in Ghana, but for all of us on the African continent and in the world. My name is Bernard Avle. This show is live and interactive. We bring the right guests. We ask them relevant questions on things that matter to you. We're running a series from today. We're looking into the crystal ball, not just for 2020, but from 2020 to 2030. And we're trying to find out what will be happening in various aspects of our life. So for the next few weeks, you'll be hearing from some of the smartest people I know on various aspects of Ghanaian society. Looking into the years ahead, what will drive change, what will influence our behavior, how long would we live, and how well will we prosper in the coming decade. I'll tell you who my guests are when we come back. Stay tuned. So tonight is not just about predictions of what's going to happen in the decade. It will try and summarize the decades if you knew a little bit about history. The 70s were very interesting in the world. Most African countries were struggling. The 80s were where a lot of them went to the Bretton Woods institutions for help. A lot started seeing reprieve in the 90s, and democracy also started. And then from the 2000s, a bit of prosperity came. Well, we're in a new decade. What will shape our behavior as people in this decade? What are the most important factors that will influence prosperity, longevity, and life in this decade? Tell us your views on these matters as we go through. I have two interesting people. The first one is a distinguished engineer, inventor, novelist, educator, and thought leader. Currently the provost of Academic Citi College. But that's just a little of what he does. So he grew up in Accra, attended both Nandom Secondary and St. Augustine's College. Bachelor's degree in manufacturing engineering in the US, and he had a minor in applied mathematics, Master of Science, Engineering Science and Mechanics from Virginia, MBA from MIT, doctorate from University of Dayton. He also has over 40 patents to his name. He is a man who's invented a lot of things in the biomedics field, and at some point in his life, he was voted among the black engineers' most promising young scientists. And in 2009, he almost became an astronaut, but that's a different story. He's also written a few books. He writes technical journals, conferences, and proceedings. And he's also a regular listener and a participant on Citi TV and Citi FM's programs. So Dr. Fred Bagonlu. Fred, great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's quite an interesting background, and we'll come to that background. I also have another interesting person, renowned entrepreneur, founder and president of Pedigree, which uses technology to solve an important problem in medicine, seeds, and cosmetics. And Bright Solution is used across the continent and indeed in other parts of the world. He's a social innovator, entrepreneur, and writer. He's also a thinker and a futurist. In fact, he was described in 2016 by the FT as frighteningly intelligent. I think you frightened them with your African print. Now, Bright has been previewed by the MIT in their Simon's list, which is the list of 35 top innovators at the time under 35. He's also a director of Imani, where he does some pro bono work in advocacy. He's a researcher with affiliation in think tanks such as APHRC, Imani, and the Center for Global Development. And Bright is a strong viewer of Africa, and he studies the continent quite strongly. Bright, welcome to the show. Good to
Thank
have
you very much.
So,
very neat and
yeah. So it's great to have both of you. So it's funny that even though a few days ago in 2019, we didn't just enter a new year, but we also entered a new decade. Are you? Let me start with Fred. Are you of the school of thought with those who think that every decade comes with its own behavior? So the 80s were this way, the 70s was this way. Does it work in such neat 70s, 80s, 90s, 2010s? Or it's a bit more nuanced than that?
I think every decade seems to come up with its own eccentricities. And somehow we found ways of naming them, you know. When they come in generations, we call them Gen X, Gen Y. So I think there is uniqueness. And even if you look within the cultural landscape itself, there was a time when it was all Afro. Then there was a time when it was all bald heads. Now we've actually migrated into a space where everybody is keeping and grooming a beard.
Except, of course, myself.
So I think
there is some truth
yes.
in that. Yes. And this is cultural. Is it also economic? Is it political? How do you... Because I know, for example, a lot of people talk of baby boomers. After the World War, a lot of the men who came back, they had kids. And I think the baby boomers are now 70. And then, of course, there's the people who were born in the 60s. In Ghana, we were born in the 80s, myself and Bright. So when we were born, Rawlings was president or head of state.
You guys are young.
Our first elected president change of president was Rawlings 96 and Kufuor as well.
2000.
Yeah, 2000, that type of thing. Yeah. So is it more cultural when we look at the decades? Is it more political? Is it more social? Is it more demographic? Which of the factors define the decades more firmly in your view?
Strong question. I'm sure in the 60s and 70s, the cultural dynamics were much more intense. In the 80s and 90s, the economics. I believe in the 2000s, technology. Other techno-optimism in the first decade and growing techno-pessimism in the second decade. But the war on terror at one point in the early 2000s appeared to define a new era of global insecurity. And some also saw the final stages of America's hegemony, which has not really panned out. So I would say technology, whether you are a techno-optimist, which defined the first decade, or a techno-pessimist, or more so techno-pessimistic than used to be the case, defining the second decade.
So in the 60s, I know there was the civil rights as well, and there were lots of cultural
dynamics.
But you feel in the 80s, it was more the economics.
Yes, because in the 80s, you had the final confrontation of East and West, Reaganomics, supply-side economics.
The Berlin Wall collapse.
The Berlin Wall collapse, which seemed to suggest the triumph of neoliberalism. You saw the economic reform program across many countries in Africa. So I think that the near triumph of neoliberalism, remember Fukuyama then writing the end of history. So I strongly feel that economics define more the 80s and the 90s than culture.
I see. I used to think it was politics and government that influence everything else. But it seems as if every decade. So you're saying in this decade and the previous, it's more technology that's driving.
That would be my vote. I would say that, even if you think of geopolitics and geoeconomics, we are entering an age where China wants to build its own internet, and we are seeing a new arms race, a technological arms race. The emphasis appears more. There's been, when the Doha Development Round collapsed and trade stopped becoming the defining theme of globalization, technology took over and became the. Now we have a new trade war between the US and China. But still, technology, I think, is the dominant.
You were born in the 70s. Do you agree with him when he says the 60s was more cultural, 80s, 90s more the economics, and post-2010 is more technology? Is that the sense you get?
Yeah, I think I would say that it's a little bit more than just technology. I think technology became a medium for us to even see some of the cultural, some of the philosophical, some of the economic implications of the age. In those days when we traveled through Lithuania and Estonia, you could see kids walking around with sagging pants, right, trying to sing rap.
Okay.
In this age, if you go to the Caribbean, kids are trying to speak like Nollywood actors. So I think it's technology, but technology became a medium to actually translate some of those cultural imperatives into this globally.
I was somewhere and somebody said we're also in an era of a clash of civilizations where, for example, you have people's views about religion and the way they see the world, leading not just to the serious rhetoric at the UN, but even wars. So they feel, of all the things that's going on in the past 20 years, and probably because of the war on terror, we're also in an era where civilizations and worldviews are coming in serious collision. And for example, if you go to the United Kingdom now, you have people who are strongly Muslim, and the communities around them, they all want to behave the same way. In fact, there are parts of the UK where there's Sharia law, for example. I don't know if you buy the argument, this idea that we're also in an era of clash of civilizations or cultures, right? So
when around the 90s, there was a view that neoliberalism had triumphed. We entered an age where people began to consider what to succeed the Cold War. Huntington, who was a very famous modernization scholar, alongside Wallenstein and others, then turned his eye into this, his focus onto this issue about civilizations. And he wrote the famous Clash of Civilizations. I think what happened, around the dissolution of the Balkans was a specific spark for that trend of thought. It has not panned out that the Clash of Civilizations is as fundamental as we thought it to be. I mean, the current assassination of Soleimani and things like that every now and then, brings it up. But if you look at, the former fault lines of global conflict, if you look at Lebanon, if you look at occupied territories in Palestine and the rest, I don't think that the same degree of dominance of world affairs is manifest in those conflicts anymore. So just take the global fault lines. Where are we seeing the most?
But there's Iran now.
That's what I'm saying. That when you see every now and then a drone assassinates someone. But the reason why the US could send a drone to assassinate someone and therefore change the calculus of conflict is very much a technological evolution of conflict.
So but even conflict is being changed by the way technology is playing out.
In some ways. But more importantly, when you look at the global fault lines, where do you see the most intense conflict? Is it in old fracture points like the Middle East and North Korea, the border, the DMZ, demilitarization zone in the Koreas? Is that where you see it or somewhere else? I see it somewhere else. I see it in the tensions around Facebook and social media and who controls these powerful new platforms. I see it in the transformation of trade dynamics with the rise of China and Southeast Asia. And so I think the 1990s obsession over the clash of civilizations, while very interesting in a brief spark of time, doesn't seem as dominant.
You wrote in one of your articles that, or in one of the answers, that it is unlikely we would have a war over water. It will more be a conflict over rights of access to the water than over the water itself. What did you mean by that?
What has happened over the last couple of years is that a lot of the inequities, a lot of the issues around the tensions have become encoded in norms that are very subtle and subterranean. What I mean by that is that increasingly how the world runs is not so transparent. So people that used to build political movements, people that used to be very effective in mobilizing mass movements, no longer seem to understand where power is circulating as well as they used to. So how right now, for instance, international capitalists dominate the structures of the world economy is much more complex. So if you remember in the early 2000s, you had the massive movement against globalization, attack the French militant NGO and others will go to Davos and they will mount massive blockades. And why? Because it was obvious that those were the symbols of world capitalism. Now, who really cares what happens in Davos? It's changed dramatically since then. So I would say that what has happened is, I always say that the world is there's always competition among two ways or two modes of hegemony. One mode is things that are super simple and understood by billions of people, like religious precepts or various theologies. And another mode is things that are extremely complex and understood by very few people, like TCP/IP that runs the internet. And it tends to shift between the two modes of power. So we are in a world now where the things that determine global power and hegemony in itself, it's increasingly more complex and people don't understand them as well.
So it's
diffused.
It's difficult to mobilize against.
It's diffused.
Because I remember and I'll come to you on technology. When I was in the university in my first year, Tete Homeku and Yao Graham came to speak to us about the World Trade Organization. And they really opened our eyes to how unfair the system was. So a lot of my friends worked in civil society against the way the neoliberal system was using WTO to deprive Africa of resources. I was at WTO last May, and it didn't seem to have quite the same force. And also, the issues were more intellectual property. It had shifted. Of course, there was still agriculture and subsidies, but it didn't seem to quite have the same level of importance that it did when I entered the university. So I think that's a profound point. Let's talk about technology. Some people say we're in the fourth industrial revolution. You've been doing a lot of innovation in the technology space. Maybe explain to the uninitiated, when we say we're in the fourth industrial revolution, what do we mean? How critical is technology today? And how come it's such an important determinant of things in the world?
Well, for many centuries, technology was in the hands of a few people. You go back to the Industrial Revolution, you had the architects of society really running all the major industries. And it's quite interesting. If you go to the Manchesters, the Birminghams, that were the centers of trust of these things, they are almost depleted, right? I think we're beginning to get to a point where we're looking more at convergence of different philosophical thoughts. It's no longer just about technology, right? It's also about a framework within which different paradigms are converging. So if you ask me what are some of the active areas of technology that we need to focus on now, I'll say we need to look at nanotechnologies.
Okay.
We need to look at biotech and biomedicine. we need to look at information technology, and we need to look at the cognitive sciences.
Okay.
Now, the future is going to be shaped by how you converge these together. And the beauty about the times in which we live now is that we are not only inventing new things, new technologies are not just being converged, they are being simultaneously disrupted. And what I mean is that, look, today artificial intelligence, everybody talks about artificial intelligence and machine learning and deep learning and reinforced deep learning. And 20 years ago, we were not saying much about this. When I first looked at AI, we were just looking at AI from the perspective of how do you morph one type of, somebody's ear to mimic another person's ear. Today, we can actually talk about AI in terms of solving some of the challenges we have here in terms of corruption. Because the computer can think billions of times faster than the normal human being. You can see trends that you cannot see just sitting down and looking at statistical data. So I think the fourth industrial revolution is basically a convergence of a series of paradigms that we have been discussing for the last half a century. But with technology developing in terms of software capabilities, in terms of hardware capabilities, these ideas are beginning to converge for us.
So you use the word convergence, but you've also spoken about disruption. Yes. And I'll come to disruption. Okay. But not everybody watching us is technologically savvy. So you said nanotechnology, biotechnology, biomedicine, cognitive science. What on earth are these things? What is nanotechnology?
So, when we talk about a nanoscale, you are looking at 1 billionth of a meter.
Oh, 1 billionth of a meter.
So to bring this into perspective, a human DNA strand, if you measure the diameter, is about 2.5 nanometers. The paper you are holding is about 100,000 nanometers in thickness.
Wow.
Now, if we can design materials at the nano level, we'll have strengths that huge steel structures cannot even match. Because at the nanoscale, you have fewer defects in the materials. The challenge now that we have is how do you scale those? So, for instance, how are we going to build a lift into space? What kind of material are you going to need to do that? And that is where the nanotechnologies come in. When you talk about nanomedicine, in the future, how are you going to deliver cancer drugs to just cancerous cells without destroying healthy cells around you? Now you talk about cognitive sciences. We talk about learning, we talk about thinking, we talk about mental organization. So it is the study of how you actually synthesize this. So how can I read what you are thinking right now? How can I read your mind? If somebody has psychological problems and they cannot communicate to the doctor, how do you diagnose that? So the whole field of cognitive science is being enabled, and that also helps artificial intelligence.
Wow. So we are able to do things which are smaller, but the things which are smaller have fewer defects, and therefore they can last longer. Exactly. And therefore they can solve bigger problems.
This is what you're problems, yes.
And then
in the biotech sector, we're talking about artificial hearts. We're talking about being able to create new biological organs, right? We're talking about being able to fit you with a prosthetic that also communicates with your brains. And these things are happening.
So what defined, what led to this? What is it? The internet? What was it that made it possible for us to start doing all these things? Was there one thing or two things?
So I need to frame this because, like I was saying earlier on, you have a techno-optimistic view, which Fred very eloquently has described, and then you have a more techno-pessimistic view as well. I would say that what we have now is a conflict between economists and technologists. And with a few exceptions like Bridolfsen or McCarthy and the rest, the majority of economists are far less bullish compared to technologists like Fred. So people like Robert Gordon and others, Arthur, Van Ack, have come up with systematic studies that show that when you take the first and the second industrial revolutions, the acceleration in productivity was massive. From 1920 to 1970, you had 3% per year on year-on-year growth. And then we've seen a situation where that productivity has declined dramatically. So I'll give you an example. Between 1996 to 2006, labor productivity was about 2.6%. It's basically stagnant since then, around 2.4%. But the more problematic situation is that total factor productivity, the efficiency in which you convert inputs into outputs, has declined even more dramatically. So from about 1.3% in 1996 to 2006 to the current situation where it's 0.3%. So we have what we now call the global productivity paradox. If all of these technologies are so powerful and so,
how come
productivity is falling? And the answer is quite simple. We had more fundamental technology inventions in the early decades. So if you think of electricity, can you imagine living without electricity compared to living without a phone?
It's impossible.
Good. So if you think of, secondly, also the nature of the efficiency,
like the steam engine,
or the
railway,
internal combustion engine.
Yes.
So if you think of moving from a horse to a car and the shift that means, compared to moving from a car to a better car,
or moving
to a self-driving
car,
from
a YAM to a digital phone.
Exactly. Those shifts have not been as profound. The other thing that we also tend to, the other mistake we tend to make is to assume that technology always grow in linear fashion. But technology is very much a product of the selective emphasis of investment. So to give you an example, I'll give you a very quick example. Hypersonic air travel, Concorde. We had hypersonic air travel in the 60s and the 70s. And we don't have hypersonic travel now because people decided we're not going to invest in Concorde anymore after the crash. It lost its legitimacy. And now, so the speed at which you can travel from London to New York is far less than you could when you had hypersonic travel.
The 60s.
The very obvious example that I see for that, even more relevant to our circumstances, is gold mining in Asante. So a lot of people forget that by the turn of the 19th century, Asante gold mining techniques had declined to the point where the Asantini was willing to offer more or less all the gold mines to the British. But if you go back 200 years before then, gold mining at Chim, Asante were at its peak. And we saw the extent to which the use of gold to buy arms and the rest built Asante hegemony. So my argument is that technology is not always linear. It depends on which area that you invest in. So Fred very brilliantly talked about nanotechnology a few seconds ago. Nanotechnology is one of those areas that is seeing declining investment, about 40% decline in investment that is going to nanotech. We are seeing, on the other hand, a boost in investment into AI. At the same time, I think blockchain is going down around 35%. So how investors perceive the trends can affect how the different technologies grow. But the key point is this, and we then go into the issue of the third industrial revolution and the fourth industrial revolution. So the way that we've typically talked about advancement of technologies has been in this tendency to look at it from discrete technology points of view. So how Moore's law, I can halve the price of a semiconductor and double the speed every 2 years or so, and things like that, Shannon's limit and things like that. But the truth of the matter is that the discrete calculations of technology growth have shifted into an increasing convergence, as he pointed out, but also hyper-integration, which is a slightly different concept, actually a radically different concept, in the sense that it's not the architecture of the technologies. So if you're thinking of Uber, there isn't really much that's profound there. But the way that they've designed the service infrastructure around it means the integration of business and technology is of a different scale. Now, what that means, therefore, is that while we've seen significant transformations of specific industries and sectors, so if you take, for instance, media, completely disrupted. If you take agriculture, on the other hand, not so much. Most of the disruption of agriculture will have ended around the 1960s, when we had the Green Revolution in India and the rest, and fertilizers and the rest came in. There hasn't been a transformation of agriculture in the last 40 years, if you think of it on a global scale. Not much has changed. Energy, we have some shifts in renewable energy and the like, but fundamentally, in terms of fundamental productivity within renewable energy, it's not very much.
So technology is not that straightforward.
In some sectors, then that goes to the last point. We have vanguard sectors where technology's impact is dramatic, like in media, in information search and retrieval. And then you have a lot of the big chunks of the rest of the economy in energy, in defense, energy, health, in education, where technology's impact has not been so dramatic.
Interesting.
If you go into a modern classroom and you look at the professor standing there doing a lecture, Aristotle will recognize that.
Same style of teaching.
Not that much different. Personalized learning, the ability to adapt material to individual learning styles, still very remote.
We'll take a short break. This is still the point of view. When we come back, we'll look at where entrepreneurship and business is headed. Is the decade going to be the decade where the gig economy and entrepreneurship dominates? We also know that Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple were the companies that defined the past 2 decades. Will they still be king in the next 10 years, or new businesses take over? What about quality of life and healthcare? And what about predictions for the decade? This is the point of view. Don't go away. Welcome back to the point of view. So we are talking to Professor Fred Makbagon-Luri. He is the president of academic Citi and Bright Simmons. I call Bagonuri an inventor and thinker, and I call Bright an innovator and a futurist. I'm sure they can argue the pieces. So we've learned a few things. The 60s and 70s were more cultural, 80s and 90s more economic, post-2000 technology is the driver. We've also spoken a lot about technology. Let's talk about business.
Business.
Entrepreneurship seems to be like a buzzword. Everybody is supposed to start their own company. You are teaching students. And I think on your profile you were saying we are training thinkers who can start their own company and that type of thing.
Yep.
So this entrepreneurship thing, is it one of the defining things for the next decade?
Well, obviously, I mean, if you follow the news in Ghana, we continue to argue that there are over 250,000 graduates who are not employed. You can extend that to Nigeria, our next door neighbors as well. So I think the question that every parent, actually as president of a university, when parents come to me, the question they ask is, are my kids or is my kid going to get a job when they graduate? And trying to make the case that our fundamental paradigm shift is actually trying to create a next generation of students that can go out there and create their own challenges and solve them, and that there are so many problems out there. Sometimes goes down well, sometimes doesn't. Because, look, even the parents themselves were trained 30, 40 years ago in an environment where you were guaranteed a job when you graduated.
Okay.
But what is quite profound, what we try to do, from similarly placed institutions and in my own professional experience, is we teach entrepreneurship from a doing perspective, which means if you come in and your major is entrepreneurship, there are specific courses that are dedicated, we call them enterprise development, where you actually focus that time to really building your enterprise while you are in school.
Okay.
The other thing that we do quite profoundly is that at the end of every semester, all the students work on a common project. And the intent is that in 2 semesters, can you take this product to a level where you can productize it?
I see.
So, you know, and then...
So you believe entrepreneurship can be taught?
I believe
entrepreneurs can be trained.
It's a practice.
It's not something you're born with.
We teach people to be
finance people. They are enterprising, and they will start their own business.
No,
is there even enterprising entrepreneurship?
No, I think they have an enabling environment
that creates that.
So
you feel in the next 10 years we're going to have more of this. The typical graduate can start his own company and do well.
I think a typical graduate can start their own company and do well. And I'll tell you, look, I've seen students design solar panels, portable solar panels, at the peak of Dumso. And then I asked myself, my grandmother is going to need this.
But they didn't make money from it. It's one thing creating a solution.
Exactly.
But the other thing is doing a business.
Because that's a concept development.
Okay.
You have to transition from a concept to a productization.
Which is what you train them for.
Exactly.
So you feel if we have 100 graduates in the next decade, what percentage will be working for themselves? What percentage will be working for somebody?
I will aim from a policy perspective to say 25% of graduating class should be able to go out there and start something.
That's what you're aiming for?
That is what I'm aiming for. But you know, if we even get 5% of the kids to do that, it's a good starting point.
Is that realistic to think that the 25% of graduates should be in a position to start their own company?
If the environment is enabling.
You think so?
Yes.
Right. What this entrepreneurship is more like a buzzword now. Everybody's doing entrepreneurship. Are you that optimistic, or you're also an pessimistic?
No, I think it's fascinating, and listening to Fred is even more fun. Certainly, we have one dimension of which you could use to argue that we have an over-entrepreneurial mindset in some respects. So if you look at the survey data, Ghanaian women are the most entrepreneurial in Africa. Slight competition from Uganda there. If you look at the informal sector, maybe 75% of the economy already in terms of labor, they are all entrepreneurs, right? All the micro-entrepreneurs that you see around. And so our entrepreneurial levels are far higher than in some other parts of the world if you consider the informal sector as micro-entrepreneurs. We also know that in the US, we have a decline in entrepreneurship nowadays. So the question is whether entrepreneurship is a professional category, or it's, as some people suggest, an entrepreneur is a mindset. So you could have people that work in companies, but they are entrepreneurial. So I get the impression that some of the work that Fred is doing at Academicity is building up the talent and the skill set of the graduates so that they're entrepreneurial wherever they find themselves.
That's right.
I think, for instance, that we need a lot more entrepreneurs in the public sector.
We do.
There is just so many things in the public sector that cannot be done without entrepreneurial thinking. some of the, particularly in our part of the world, where you don't have the institutions that are very strong, we need people in the public sector that says, okay, if you're going to do a digital addressing system, you can't use the existing institutions. They don't think that way. So you're going to need people that think in very dramatically different ways. So all of that is interesting. But that then brings us back to the earlier discussion we're having, which was this issue of imbalances, which we didn't get to touch upon. We have a highly unproductive service segment of the economy, which is also the fastest growing. Of course, agriculture has always been a backwater, so I don't want to even talk about agriculture. But in the service sector, you have a lot of room for increasing productivity. So how many times have you gone to a restaurant and they've taken 1 hour to bring your food? That is because most people don't realize that. Okay, good. What most people don't realize is that if you take the restaurant backroom operation, it's very industrial. Taking the orders, getting the ingredients together, and producing it. So it's not that different from manufacturing. But we get really bogged down in this view of the manufacturing sector being the only high productivity sector. No, you can have a lot of high productivity service sector, logistics integration, courier management, all of these things. So we have a procurement. We have this problem where a lot of our entrepreneurs are just not productive. So rather than to focus only on entrepreneurship, we have to start to focus on productivity in entrepreneurship. Because I think there's a lot of people that struggle to keep teams in Ghana because everybody wants to go and set up their own thing, which is fine and it's great. But we also need to have a situation where people only move if they have a certain bar they want to meet.
So productivity than simply the starting of a business.
Exactly.
You agree with this?
Yeah, there's also another point that I need to add. Because where often that productivity is lacking, the employees get fired rather than trained. So we don't also have a training mindset that for you to get that restaurant going, you have to do incremental training, and quite often. But most of the time when people don't show up or people provide poor services, they get fired and somebody new comes in. So it becomes a rotating door, and you cannot be productive that way. Supervision.
Okay, let me.
No, there's one more point.
Yes.
I think another challenge we have here, why entrepreneurs have a challenge, is that there's no strong legal framework actually supporting that. And if you look at most of our law firms, very few of them really have partnerships. They are mostly one-man show because even with them as lawyers, they cannot maintain a legal framework that ensures that people actually bring in cases and make money from it without doing side.
So I was looking at...
Can I say 10 seconds? Okay. Another thing that is also important is the growing tendency to look at production ecosystems rather than firms, by which I mean companies, as the most viable units of production. What do I mean by that? There is a whole new literature pioneered by people in Colombia and elsewhere. One gentleman called Sebel is very well known for that, where we have been looking at contracting. And in the past, the way you did design production was to have these firm, strong contracts. And then to do everything as much as you could within your own firm. Now, there's a lot of open source software. There's a lot of open architecture, production systems. How you source and how you co-innovate is no longer based on tight contracts. So you have a situation where you do a very basic contract, and you say, we'll figure it out. Because we don't really know what we're going to create. We are going to innovate together. And a lot of the new economy and digital economy stuff that is evolving is based on this type of open contract.
Interesting. So when I entered secondary school, the biggest companies in the world, if you took the list of the most influential companies, you have Coca-Cola, IBM, General Electric, General Motors, Procter & Gamble. If you did the same list today, you will see different companies. You will see Apple, you will see Facebook, you will see Google, you will see Amazon, you will see Alibaba. So some of this we've discussed already. How long will these companies dominate before something else takes over? Because GE, they have to. GM had to even be saved by Obama in 2008, right? P&G is not as. It's still a big company. So clearly, you've explained why we are an industrial revolution. But how long will the likes of Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Alibaba, how long will they dominate before something else takes over? Will it be for the next 100 years?
If you go back 100 years, the companies that were on top of their game, I'll probably say one or two transform into something else, like Standard Oil, and survived. I think that it's actually going to be faster. I think in the next 20 years, we'll be talking about a different set of companies. Yes.
They're not going to do 50-year domination.
Bright also mentioned the fact that some of the investments in nanotechnology, for instance, has significantly declined. What is interesting about technology is that I always argue that it has 3 lives. The first time it comes and somebody tries to kill it, it comes back the second time, and the third time somehow it survives. You also have to look at where some of these big countries, what they are interested in. If the United States want to go to Mars in the next 10 years, what are the enabling technologies that they're going to need? And they are going to go back and revive technologies that they have shelved in the 60s.
Interesting.
I really think that, with our desire to live longer, people want to live longer. People are forgetting to take their medicine. Are there ways to deliver medicine to you without you really knowing about it? I think the biotech, the cognitive side, the infotech is going to drive stuff. And I talk about the convergence of these technologies. I don't know what they're going to look like. Once you start putting nanotechnology, biotech, and cognitive sciences and IT together, we're talking about new infrastructures, new technologies. Now, IT could be the enabling platform. So they may still look and feel like the Facebooks, but the underlying technologies will be fundamentally different. So I think in the next 20, 30 years, it's not going to be Facebook.
Well, because they're getting bigger. Right. I know you've written a bit about this when you were asked. Indeed, you did an article on this where you spoke about hyper-integration. So I don't want you to go into the whole thing. But the question I'm asking is, by 2030, will Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Alibaba, not in that particular order, but these are the top 6, will they still be the giants by end of this decade?
One way to look at it is to look at the categories. So if you look within technology, particularly digital technology, you see that the losers and winners are more stuck. So when I was first setting out and I needed a strategic partner, we went to Hewlett-Packard. It was at that time the most valuable technology company in the world. It was extremely well-respected in various categories. Its market cap has dropped from about $200 billion to $29 billion today within the technology category. At the same time, the world's most valuable company now, you may quibble a little bit about where its valuation sits and all that, but it's still Saudi Aramco now. And Saudi Aramco is an oil company. A 1950s technology behemoth, if you think of when that space became interesting. So in categories, you're going to see much more radical declines, but there are still some structures within the economy that are very geopolitically and geoeconomically determined. So energy, it's not just shift within technology itself that is going to disrupt or transform energy. It's going to be political decisions that are made around renewable energy and the likes of it, and the companies that can move in and that regard. So it comes back to the
So like will electric cars, for example, replace fossil fuel-driven cars in the next 10 years?
Good question. So yes, it comes back to this issue of, okay, what will happen in the next decade, which is the theme of this conversation. I strongly feel that we are now at the stage where we are beginning to discover whether the so-called third industrial revolution will pan out, and by which I mean the rise of digital, the digitalization of everything. So it is true that everything has become cyber-enabled, but the fact of that matter doesn't mean that the fundamental economics in each sector are convergent. So the technologies are coming together, but the economics are still different in the different sectors. And that is, to me, the driving force. So going forward, for instance, will digitalization transform education and health? I feel that the next decade is the decade of infrastructure development, building up a whole new set of infrastructure. Where I disagree with the techno-optimists, so to give you an example, Rifkin, for instance, believed that the big transformation you're going to see is the internetization of energy.
Internetization.
So what is going to happen is that you're going to have these smart grids.
Internetization.
You're going to have these smart grids that enable anybody to generate renewable energy and sell it to anybody else. And then you're going to have Internet of Things as the underlying platform on which then enables you to have a mass new infrastructure. And all of that will be renewable energy powered. I think that's too optimistic for the next decade. And if you look at other futurists like Ray Kurzweil, who are talking about the singularity and how you're going to see human beings capable of uploading their consciousness into machines by 2045 and the rest, I think they are way too optimistic. Why? Because what technology does is that it simplifies infrastructure, but it complexifies institutions. It makes institutions more complex.
Can you repeat that?
So if you take...
no, just repeat it.
No, I'm saying that technology tends to simplify infrastructure, but it tends to make institutions more complex. And which I use, then I had this word I called complexify.
So it simplifies infrastructure, but makes institutions more complex.
Exactly. So an example of that is to take the social media landscape, which is create a new media format, right?
Yes.
What people don't realize is that currently, Facebook, Google, the other big social media websites, they are now approaching something like 100,000 digital moderators or censors. Whereas just 5 years ago, they had pledged to use algorithms to do that management work.
So now they have 100,000 employed people.
Often contractors, managed by contractors, who are sitting there trying to moderate Facebook to make sure people are not putting porn,
killing each other, people cutting off heads and things.
What does that mean? What that means is that while Facebook has made it so easy for a new form of media to emerge, it's a simplified infrastructure, it's now find itself against this hurdle of what kind of institution is required to manage the side effects and
so the institution is more complex.
It's now more complex.
The platform infrastructure is simpler.
Because we don't know how to deal with it. Yeah. If you try to say, okay, the government's, the National Media Commission in Ghana should now have a role in policing social media, how will you exactly build that?
Wow.
So we find a situation where a lot of technologies sometimes underestimate the sheer scope. Let me give you a very final one. Take self-driving cars. Almost every analysis I've seen assumes that it's a discrete technology problem. How can we build, chips that are so smart that you can make a situation around computer vision, as an example, so they can easily discriminate between who is actually crossing the road and what is an object that is not a human being and things like that. The truth, though, is that here is the biggest challenge with self-driving cars. If you allow people to be able to dispatch their cars without sitting in them, you need some kind of mass transit management system. Because otherwise, people are going to be able to send their cars to cause accidents. I'll just sit home, send my car just to cause confusion. Or I can run drags with my cars in a very coordinated fashion, and it's very difficult for you to intercept because I'm not in them. I can sit anywhere. I can sit in Spain and have cars moving all across America. So you're going to have to need a municipal system that creates a hyper infrastructure on which you manage those self-driving cars. Those things are very complex to build. It's like building a new internet for physical things.
Wow.
So these are the challenges that I think are going to be addressed in the next decade, even more than people think of discrete new inventions.
We need to take a break, but there's a fundamental question we need to address, whether the next decade will be Africa's decade. Because clearly, the Asians have had their time, and from the 60s to the 70s, we've seen Singapore, South Korea. Latin America attempted to emerge. We don't know what's happening to their emergence. But we are wondering whether 2020 to 2030 will mark the beginning of Africa's, I don't want to call it renaissance or emergence. But we'll tackle that question and read your comments when we come back. This is still The Point of View. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Point of View. We are looking into the crystal ball for the next 10 years. And it's a series of programs I'll be running. We'll be looking at different sectors. We'll be looking at business in greater detail in the coming weeks. We'll also look at the economy and some of those things. But tonight I'm talking to an inventor and an innovator, Bright Simmons and Dr. Mark Bagonluri. Very interesting predictions. Final question for the night. Will this be Africa's decade? We know that in the late 60s and 70s, indeed, up until the 80s, certain countries in a certain geopolitical space all transformed. People have said a lot about Africa. Are you an Afro-optimist or an Afro-pessimist?
Well, I hate to sit on national TV and say, no, it's not going to be the Africa's decade. I think we are missing a few fundamentals.
Okay.
I think our educational institutions are still pretty much broken. When I look at where the world is headed, in terms of where technology is going, and we are still caught up in looking at every field of human endeavor as a discrete field, right? Some of the most active areas of research, we are not even talking about them. Our challenges in renewable in the energy sector are not being addressed at a research level. We still talk about poor roads, but really what we're talking about is that we don't have transportation infrastructure. Because if you can move people with drones, do you really need roads? So
we are thinking in silos and blocks.
We are thinking in silos.
We are not synthesizing.
We are not synthesizing it. And I don't think we have a strategic platform for which to make up this decade Africa's decade. We don't. We are still, even our raw materials, we are not creating value out of our raw materials. We are still selling raw materials.
We are still talking about bauxite.
We're still talking about
China,
bauxite.
1 billion.
We're still talking about shipping cocoa out for processing. Our classrooms are overstuffed. I've visited universities where you have 100 students, 200 students sitting in there. And how can you actually deliver a hands-on quality education with this many people?
So it means we are not ready. You're saying we are not...
we are not ready. We are just, it's aspirational. I think as an African, obviously, 10, 15 years ago, I thought we were really in the African Renaissance where things were going to happen. But you see, what gives me hope is when I look at Rwanda and I'm seeing things happening. And I'm saying, how are they doing it? And we can't do it. And we are not doing it yet. So for me, I think we are 2 decades away, really, from where we need to be. I think the next decade should be about what kind of infrastructure do we need to internalize so that we can leverage that.
We need to do for the continent to really emerge. What is it? Is it education? Is it infrastructure? If we're to focus on one important change agent that we should invest in, would it be education?
I would say education. Obviously, from where I sit. But when I
what type of education?
I think technical education. I think we need to educate our people themselves. There are behavioral education that we also need.
Interesting.
Because look, technology, you cannot disseminate technology when people are not even educated about them. So if you start hearing the conversation about development engineering, everybody is talking about how do you go into areas, identify problems with the locals, and co-create solutions with them. Because often, if you bring external technologies to them, they will not accept them. So technology is not just the problem, it's also about education. How do we bring the populace along on this journey?
So it's not just formal school education. It's not just formal education. We need behavioral education. Do people stop when you try to cross the zebra crossing? People don't. So there's a lot of work to be done.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Do we have the quality of leadership that's willing to... Because again, if you look at what you've seen globally, you're seeing younger leaders emerge. There was this photo on Facebook of some people in Finland. They're in their 30s. The typical African leader is about 75 or 70-something. Is that also part of the thing, that you need a new type of leader or a new type of leadership mentality to buy the kind of future we want?
Well, you see, I've met a few old people that are technocentric. You know, so I wouldn't dwell too much on the leadership type saying that, and I would just say, look, you just need good leaders. You need visionaries. Nkrumah wasn't a kid when we built the Tama Harbour or the Takoradi Harbour or the Tama Motorway. He was an adult. It's about scoping up a vision and rallying the nation around this vision. I don't think the age matters. Age may help, but I don't think it matters.
Our techno-optimist is not very optimistic because he thinks we deal with problems from a very... We are not synthesizing. We are not seeing the bigger picture. I'm guessing you are with him on this.
Yes, I mean, there is certainly the issue of growth. At 3.3%, West Africa growth in 2019.
Is it economic or population growth?
Economic growth. 3.3%, some say 4%, I'm doubtful, maybe 3.8% in the coming year. We completely lost. Because, like you pointed out, population growth in some countries, like in Niger and elsewhere, is already 6%. So if you're growing at 3-point-something%, you're literally retrogressing. Particularly also when we have infrastructure that is weaker and therefore depreciation is higher. And it's very hard to factor depreciation into all of these calculations. So we have a growth problem, a fundamental growth problem where we need more aggression. Some of that is systems leadership. We have got to a stage where even the most effective designers of individual discrete parts of our lives, whether it's the government introduces drones to do vaccine drops from the sky or whatever. Those blood. It's not as effective nowadays as how you design new systems. So if you take the national health insurance system, what is our systematic leadership there? Who is that visionary who is produce some kind of clearly groundbreaking theory of how you do national health insurance in a context where 95% of it is taxation? What kind of insurance is that? And to think that we don't have academics that think about this stuff and publish stuff about it and tell people that, look, you can't have an insurance system that's 95% taxation or 90% tax. It doesn't make sense. You get my point?
We are not even engaging the basic questions.
A new kind of systematic leadership where they see systems. And they don't always have to be just politicians. And this is where I have the biggest
systematic leadership.
The room for engagement of other types of thought leaders is completely absent. So what we have now is that unless you have political power or economic power of the likes of Dangote, you don't matter in Africa. I've always said to people, give me an example of an African thought leader of the stature of, say, Jeffrey Sachs, who can go into an African country and see a president because of the quality of his thoughts or her thoughts. Give me one.
If he doesn't have money, he doesn't have a chance.
It's a challenge to you. Name one African who, if he were to come to
all
Ghana,
of them have money.
Either they have money
or they
have political power. And that is actually, to my mind, the bane of the African situation right now. We don't have any respect at all for thought leadership. So everybody has to go and make money or go and find power. And they will tell you that, look, if you think you are smart, go and run for elections. And they think as if they're smart. Yeah. I've heard it several times on social media where I've made my views known on something. They say, but if you're that smart, go and stand for elections and go and, But that's stupid.
So it means they see only political leadership
power or material power. So either if your ideas are so good, go and make money. They forget that people like Edison, Tesla, and the rest never made money.
They did not.
A lot of the greatest of our inventors, Vannevar Bush, he never made money. He never served in office. But he designed more or less the national defense architecture of the US, the RAND Corporation, all of these things that you think are thought leaders who are given space to do it. So to the extent that Africa still doesn't respect its thought leaders and actually doesn't have it, any
you
category.
Don't think we have any thought leaders?
We don't have category. They may exist in their own discrete location, but there's no category for it. There's no category for it. There's no category for it.
Yeah. There's no room for it.
Exactly. So nobody makes an effort to define what systems have to be made. And the reason why systems are important is this. Like I pointed to you about national health insurance. Look at what is happening in our energy system. They think it's a matter of negotiating some contract, and you know. It's about the design of the whole system. And the kind of thinking that you need to be able to take all of these multiple dimensions and produce it requires a kind of thought movement. Somebody or group of people in universities who've spent decades studying it and are given the room to make really groundbreaking ideas. Let me give you bauxite. I have read theses, university theses, going back from the 70s. And if you read them today, the exact same problem they describe about why we cannot have an integrated aluminium system exists. Yet, just a year ago, we had very important political figures talking about integrated aluminium. And they are, from what they were saying, it was quite clear to me that you have no awareness about the bauxite system, the aluminium system in Ghana. So this inability to learn, if it continues into the next decade, I assure you, the best we're going to have on the continent, and so this is my prediction, is a Latin American situation where the more democratic and conflict-free countries make some advancements, but we see the conflict-prone areas in the Sahel and the rest retrogress. And within the countries that are making progress, we're going to see situations like we see in Ghana, where almost 85 to something % of all inbound investment to Ghana come to Accra. So what you're going to see is the balkanization of the continent in terms of individual states as well as the region. So my prediction, until something dramatically changes, is that we're going to see Accra get extremely wealthy. We're going to see megapolises emerge, so the central region and the rest join up with Accra. And over time, they may be able to force the political leadership to give them even self-governance up to a certain point.
So cities can become very powerful.
Cities are going to be very powerful. And they're going to have cities connect to other cities.
Lagos, Accra.
More connected than Accra, Tamale. Already, the Lagos-Accra nexus is much more stronger than the Accra-Wa, Accra-Bolga, and in some instances, the Accra-Tamale nexus. But what do I mean by that? The amount of traffic, the number of people whose business partners are there, etc. is growing. So we're going to see an intercity network across the continent. We're going to see an increasing inability of thought leaders to emerge, which means that the strong politicization of these matters that are so important to us will continue. In those countries that have democracy, there'll be polarization among parties. And then you have some countries that are trying the developmental state approach like Rwanda, which will continue to do well, but because of the nature of our institutional growth in those places, you're also going to see conflicts re-emerge.
Let me read some comments. Good evening, Bernard. Your panelists are great. This is coming from Kofi Seydou. Bernard, in answer to your question as to whether the next decade or so is for Africa, I will say emphatically no. Africans hate each other. It cannot happen. Julius Amegashi says the big tech giants, Apple and the likes, may still rule the world in the sense that they have collected so much data on us since they gradually become an integral part of our lives. To earn a part of the chunk, we have to leverage the power of the crowd. Or I don't mean cloud or crowd. Kenneth from Kokrobite, what will shape the decade is technology. I'm wondering how the rise of the gig economy will disrupt our country. What kind of education are we giving to the youth to empower them to innovate, to build global businesses? BG Cyrus, this decade will be driven by real human liberty and the freedom of the human mind. This will occur as a form of revolution. Technology will play a major role, but in all, the church will suffer. I see. Kojo Amonsa says, Bernard, I think AI will be a technology to watch in this decade. Now, there are AI systems in the forex trading, and with or without training, the system is designed to trade on your behalf. This decade will still be dominated heavily by technology. Bernard, it takes a nano brain to come up with a topic such as this for a TV show. In the next decade, I see robots fighting with humans for space at the workplace. It's already started at the telco call centers, Jerome Secom in Hacho. This one is a final one. Good evening, Bernard. Happy New Year. That's all. That's from Salif Janga. Good evening, Happy New Year. That's all. I've been talking to Dr. Fred Bagonluri, president of Academic City College. How many patents do you have? 40?
48 written.
48
22
written.
issued.
22 issued. Yeah. He's a big man. Bryce Simmons runs a nano multinational. It's in all continents. He's a big man. Thank you guys for being on the show. So one is an inventor, one is an innovator, one is a thinker, one is a futurist. I'm just a journalist. Thank you for watching. We'll continue with the series in our next show. Stay with us. Bye-bye. Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on Citi TV's YouTube channel. Subscribe for more videos on The Point of View. My name is Bernard Avle. Thank you.
The Point of View with Bernard Avle. Monday and Wednesday nights, only on Citi TV.